So yeah, welcome to this talk. Maybe a very short disclaimer before I start. AI and ML are obviously not the same thing, yet I will be using these two terms interchangeably in this talk. The reason is that most of AI security work is actually ML security work, but it's hard to recruit practitioners who only work with ML. So just to spare us a lot of nitpicking, I'll be using this interchangeably. But let's dive right in. So there's three parts in this talk. First, I want to talk a little bit about what AI security is, what I mean here concretely, and what I mean by practical. And then we will see how we can, as he said, how we can make more realistic threat models, more practical threat models. And I will explain all this using one attack as a running example, but obviously we surveyed more than one attack. So in the end, I will give you the bigger picture and present some other findings for some other attacks. So let's dive right in. AI security or ML security. It's actually out of curiosity, so who knows this picture? Or is similar, who is? Just raise your hands if you've seen it, there's another one with a gibbon, or okay, so a lot of people. The idea is you have an image classifier, it outputs the correct class, you add a perturbation, and the output is wrong. So this is called evasion or adversarial example. And when I talk about practice, what I mean is actually applied AI out there, for example, in an autonomous vehicle or in a company. And there is a lot of criticism how practical these attacks are. I won't be iterating about all of this. But when you ask practitioners, AI engineers, whether they find this attack to be practical, some say yes, some say no. And when we look at the reason that people say they find this attack irrelevant, there is a lot of interesting things they tell us. They say, well, I just don't think it's relevant in my use case. Or they say, I just don't see how an attacker could benefit financially from running this attack. But something they also say is, we have access control on our data. And I find this so remarkable because if you think about, or if you've ever seen ML security presentations, in contrast to security presentations that usually start with a headliner and this made so much damage, we're fixing this. And in AI security, often we just start, well, we have this established problem and we're trying to fix it. So there isn't really much evidence that this is happening. And I find this is a very crucial information about why this could be the case. So let's think about how we can put these two things together. So how can we understand how practical our threat models are and how well they actually align? So something we could do is we look at all the attacks that we have. Again, I'll be doing it for evasion adversarial examples in this talk. We look at these attacks and we see the threat models that have commonly been studied. And for evasion, naturally, you have to submit test data. You may need access to the model. And once we know that, we can actually put this into a questionnaire. And we ask practitioners, do you give access to your data? Do you give access to your model? That gives us a hint about how many models are actually accessible for an attacker, for example. And then we match them. So before I dive right in, just a brief comment on our sample. So we were able to recruit 271 participants about a year ago. All of these were AI engineers, data engineers. Pretty much we recruited anyone who worked with AI and was able to provide information about data set sizes, model access, data access, the things that I just mentioned. And just to be clear, so this doesn't necessarily include people who work with ChatGPT, for example, prompt engineers or so. So we really require technical knowledge here. And so there is a large survey done every year by Kaggle, mentoring about 24,000, I think, AI engineers. And when we match our demographic with theirs, like age, gender, education, it actually matches that sample. So we assume that this is representative of this larger population. But let's get back to the attack. So what is the threat model, the underlying threat model that we're assuming here? So I said earlier, okay, so we compute this perturbation. The way that you can do this is by doing a backward pass through the model, computing the gradients to get this perturbation. So the access that you need ultimately is the model. You need the input. You compute the forward pass, the backward pass. So you also need the output. So you need full access. This is called a white box attack. Now, if you know how gradients work, you can also say, when you can drop the model, you query a couple of times, and then you approximate the gradient. So this would be a black box model. So we don't need access to the model anymore, we just need access to the inputs and the outputs. Now, there's a lot of other implicit aspects in here. Like some is that you actually know how the input data looks like. Another thing is that you're also like able to submit it. So these are not necessarily in particular the data distribution. This is nothing that we looked at. So we really just were interested in the very basic things that you need when you attack a model. And then something that's maybe also a little bit implicit is, well, you also, once you have the perturbed sample, you need to be able to submit it. But like then the input is already like entailed in the threat model. So like that's also nothing I'll be looking at more in detail. So but these are the two threat models we're essentially looking at, white box and black box for evasion. So let's compare that with our sample. So 100% here is like the 271 participants whom we ask if they give access to their model, to their inputs, and to their outputs. And if we now think about white box evasion, then what we find is like less than 5% of people give access to inputs, outputs, and the model. So this is the amount of models in their population where you could actually, as an attacker, as a third party, run a white box evasion attack. If we now say, okay, so we're not requiring the model, we're doing a black box attack, then this is a lot more. So this is about a third, where actually like the white box threat model like counts in as well, right? Because you don't need the model, you just drop the model, you still have access to input and output. So this is about a third, and they would be vulnerable to a black box attack. Then obviously we have a large part of the sample who state that nothing of these properties is accessible. So these are people who just simply, they are not vulnerable to evasion. And this helps us understand maybe why we see few incidents of attacks, because there is a large fraction of the people who just literally aren't like vulnerable to this attack. And then you also see another group, this is like other on a reply, consider that this information can potentially be sensitive, whether things are like accessible or not. So people can maybe not provide it for that reason, or maybe they have a specific setting where it doesn't make sense to share outputs. So this could be another reason why we don't have information on that. So if you either know about about black box attacks, or you listen very carefully, then you maybe heard that I said, we just sample a couple of times. So the question is how often? Like obviously, if I sample a lot, the gradient estimate gets better. But then the question is, okay, so we know that in principle, inputs and outputs are available, but we don't know how many queries. And this can be a crucial difference, because in theory, it could be just one query. And then it's very different very difficult to run this attack. So what we looked also at was a survey about black box evasion attacks. And they did great work for us because they monitored the amount of queries that black box attacks need. Just to be clear about this figure, so this is percent of the amount of papers that they studied, which is 32. So it's not a lot, there's way more work on that, but I think it's a good estimate. And what we see is that most papers in black box evasion assume infinitely many samples. And I want to be clear that this makes perfect sense from a scientific perspective, because first you want to make the point that it's possible and you don't care about the amount of samples. And then as the threat model is established, you can go and you can show that it's possible with less queries. But it's pretty much what we see here, where there is a peak like around 100 to 1K queries, and there is a couple of papers that are below that. So let's match that to what our participants said. And you see the majority of them still is not giving access to their model. And then you see this bimodal distribution followed up, so second mostly unconstrained many sampled queries. And the second one is less than 100. And what we don't know at this point is the unconstrained many, if this is something that they could provide less, or whether this is actually necessary. But we see this bimodality and we see this slight misalignment of where many papers exist and what we would need to actually attack a system in the wild. Okay, so at this point, as I said, so we did not only look at evasion, because there is not only evasion, there is a lot of different attacks. This is probably also not a complete list. But we looked at many of these. So let me just quickly go through them and summarize a couple of findings that we have. So in backdoors, there is this interesting assumption that models are reused. So I think with the usage of LLMs, it has become more clear that this is actually a thing. So you take a model and you fine-tune it. But when I researched this like 2 years ago for a paper that we were writing, I couldn't find any citable evidence that this is actually true. But we found it's true. So 50% of a sample states that they use models, like they take a model that exists already and then they fine-tune it for their own purposes. Similar to backdoors, poisoning is also a training time attack. So it relies on the training data to be available. And what we find is that and it makes sense in terms of intellectual property. So people are very secretive about their training data. They don't want this to be accessible. Yet, what we also find is although it's not accessible, it may be sourced from public sources. So this may be, again, a source for vulnerability. Then, this is sort of one of the rarer attacks. It's called sloth attacks. So you abuse that there is an energy-saving library. And then you sort of submit a sample that like nullifies the effect of this energy-saving library. And what we did is we asked our participants, are you actually using this kind of library? And a lot of them do. And I think it's very crucial to understand that and to understand, okay, so what we maybe should start doing is like, okay, there are several of these libraries, do a text transfer across them. To really start investigating these threat models that are very rarely studied now, but they are very relevant. And then something else I found very interesting is if you look at membership inference or model stealing, or also in a way black box evasion. So these are attacks where you submit a sample and you try to get information from the model about like the inner workings, like to deduce information about the training data or to just understand how the model will classify something. So in some cases, you can see the output, but you cannot alter the input. And most of our attacks assume, okay, I'm submitting this input and then I'm seeing the output and this is super efficient and this is good because this is a frequent threat model. But there exists also in some cases the threat model where you cannot control the input. And we just don't know what this means for vulnerability. So this is really also an area where we would need more research. Okay, so let me conclude this talk. So AI security research is not based on practical settings. And again, this is per se nothing bad, like we relied on threat modeling to develop these attacks. And I also have to say, I mean, we could have been doing much worse. So for all of the attacks that we studied, we found that they could be run on models out there that are actually deployed. In some cases only, like in 3 or 5% of the population, but it exists, so it is there. But I hope you also understood from my talk. So there is new threat models, there are threat models which are slightly different, slightly misaligned. So we will need more research adapting to that to actually really do a threat assessment and to actually be ultimately able to defend companies when it comes to that these attacks become more frequent. All right, yeah, thank you very much. Let me know if you have questions.